click subscribe and hit that bell notification. So 1 Samuel 28, we studied 1 through 2 already. There's a massive scene shift. So we just came off of David being called to go to war with the Philistines. Their greatest enemy, David, is now in camp with them. He's like best friends with their king. Life is great, everything's wonderful. And then the king's like, go to war with us. That's what we find in verse 1 and 2. And then all of a sudden we read in verse 3, now Samuel had died and all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in Ramah, his own city. And Saul had put the mediums and the necromancers out of the land. So here's a question for you. Why are we talking about Samuel? And why are we talking about necromancers or witches or sorcery? So we just went from David living in Philistine, best friends with the king, to all of a sudden we're talking about Samuel. Who's Samuel? He's the prophet who died. David was upset about it. So it's really important when we're reading our Bibles to recognize that there's a massive shift here. This is all in between verse 2 and verse 3. We are talking about two different stories, two different groups of people in two different locations at two different times. We drastically change scenes. Okay, so we're going to find out why we're talking about Samuel and why we're talking about necromancers. Because in verse 4, the Philistines assembled and came and encamped at Shunem, and Saul gathered all Israel, and they encamped at Gilboa. So we need to know about Samuel. We need to know about the necromancers because the Philistines are coming against Saul. So this is very important for what's about to happen in the story. Saul is being attacked. He is gathering all Israel to battle. Has this happened before? What was the results of Saul's battle with the Philistines? He crushes them. He does a really good job, lots of good things. He's been victorious in battle. And generally speaking, every time this has happened, he's walked away being victorious. So we're introduced to a common scene, but something else is going to happen. Something's shifting here. Verse 5. When Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid and his heart trembled greatly. And when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams or by Urim or by prophets. So why was Saul afraid? He was trembling in fear of the Philistines. Why? So Saul gets no direction from the Lord. That's why this is difficult. Every time he's gone up into battle, he's either had godly people around him, like Sam mentioned with David or Jonathan, somebody who is inspired by God to take action to bring victory, or he had prophets, or he had the Urim or the Thummim, or some other communication from God. But right now, God has abandoned him. He is all alone and he has no direction to move forward. He's afraid because he's walking in darkness. God has always been his light. God's people have always been his light. And now he's all alone in the dark and he's panicking. Why does it mention that the Urim did not produce God's direction? Who has the Urim and the Thummim? They are like stones. Only one person has them. Who has them? The priest. The high priest has them in his ephod or his robe. When somebody comes into the temple and they need to inquire of God, we don't know what this looks like. We don't know if the stones glowed. We don't know if they made noise. We don't know if they put him behind his back and said, pick a hand. We have no idea. It doesn't tell us. All we know is that people would inquire from the high priest, and the high priest would use the Urim and the Thummim inside the ephod to produce God's will for that situation or for that person. Why can't he use the Urim or the Thummim? Because he killed them. Saul had turned on the priests and murdered an entire village. And there was one survivor, the son of the high priest, Abiathar. Where did the son of the high priest run to? To King David. He's not the king right now. So when David said, hey, bring the ephod over here, we need to inquire of the Lord, it's most likely he's using the Urim and the Thummim. And so Saul can't use it because he murdered them. So he has murdered the people of God. Samuel is gone. He drove David away. He turned his back on the Lord. The Lord became his enemy. We'll talk about that in a second. And he's all alone, wandering by himself. Obviously, he's got thousands of people with soldiers, but he doesn't have a game plan because he's a poor leader and doesn't know how to lead. So at least David tries his best. Don't take David's example of not following the Lord and not taking direction first. But at least David tried to use some kind of wisdom to take action. Saul is so inept, he's stuck in the mud. He's a truck in the sand and the tide is coming in. It says in verse 6, when Saul inquired of the Lord, verse 7, then Saul said to his servants, seek out for me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her. And his servant said to him, behold, there is a witch, I like calling her a witch at Endor. You remember how we were talking about, why are we talking about Samuel? Why are we talking about this witch? So why are we talking about a witch? He wants answers. So what's his solution? Go to somebody who can get me answers. He's so desperate. So he asks, so very good point. I think I got ahead of myself and I didn't read the whole text. So thank you. That's actually very important. So back in verse 3, it says, Samuel died and Saul had put the mediums and the necromancers out of the land. He drove them away. He killed them if they stayed in the land. So if you're a witch, if you're a medium, if you're a sorcerer, if you practice any kind of witchcraft, Saul condemned you to death. And so he drove them out of the land, which is actually a very good thing according to God's law. So now he's like, I know, get me a medium, get me a witch. I need a witch. He's destroying the very thing that he built. Verse 8, so Saul disguised himself and put on other garments and went, he and 2 men with him. And they came to the woman by night. And he said, divine for me a spirit and bring up for me whomever I shall name to you. The woman said to him, surely you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and the necromancers from the land. Why then are you laying a trap for my life to bring about my death? So she is suspicious. Saul knows what he's doing. Saul knows that he is going to find somebody that he potentially threatened in the past. So what does he do? He puts on different robes. He dresses down. He's not dressing up. Normally he's got royal robes on. He looks like a king. He acts like a king. He walks like a king. But when he wants to go be a dog, he starts acting like a dog. He starts barking like a dog. He changes his appearance to deceive this woman. And she is not having it. She is like, why are you here? You know what Saul has done. Like, everybody knows what Saul has done. You're risking my life. Why would I help you? Verse 9, she says, you risk my life. Verse 10, what's his solution? Saul swore to her by the Lord, as the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing. What is he doing there? He's swearing an oath. You know what he's saying? In our day and age, in our culture, I swear to God. I swear to God. Now, back in this day, it actually meant something. It's like a handshake. A handshake meant something. Exactly. He's saying, nope, I will do everything in my power to protect you. Let the Lord judge between me and you. It's interesting that he is referring to God as the supreme authority and the solution to his problem, even though God, the supreme authority, is the problem that he can't solve. He still has a connection to his religion. He still has a connection to the light. But he himself is darkness. And this is what happens in the world, is people like masquerading in the light. People like acting like they have a relationship with God, that they are in right standing with God. and saying things that I align myself with this authority, but they themselves are at war with him. They themselves are in darkness and they hate the light. But when it benefits them, I swear to God, his heart has become callous. He's become hard to the reality of God and the world around him, and he has given up all standards. He has no objection to doing something wrong and evil. I think we found that out when he kept chasing down David. He has taken this path downward year after year after year. Now, he's been on the throne 15, 20 years. God said, I'm going to remove you, and 15 years later, he's still there. He's gotten complacent. He doesn't think God is paying attention. He thinks he can get by without actually having to pay his dues. God said, this is the consequence for your actions, but he didn't see it happen quickly. And so he's willing to continue to act like he's walking with God and doing the right thing, even though he knows he's running far away from God. Verse 11, then the woman said, whom shall I bring up for you? And he said, bring up Samuel for me. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice, and the woman said to Saul, why have you deceived me? You are Saul. The king said to her, do not be afraid. What do you see? And the woman said to Saul, I see a God coming up out of the earth. Verse 14. He said to her, what is his appearance? And she said, an old man is coming up, and he is wrapped in a robe. And Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed his face to the ground and paid homage. Why? We know he went to the necromancer. We know that he went to the medium, but we didn't know why he was going there. So why does he ask for Samuel? That's his mentor. So Samuel can ask God. What's interesting is this is what people do all the time. They pray to dead people. They're like, I have no living hope. I don't have somebody or something that has a living reality of God in my world, so I have to pray to a dead person. Obviously, this is not including Jesus, because Jesus is alive. So a lot of religions, a lot of places, they adhere to communicating with human beings who are dead. This is like Marianism, talking to saints of old or some other entity outside of the Trinity, outside of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Human beings crave to worship anything other than God. It's fascinating. So where God turned his back on Saul, Saul was willing to go to the dead because he couldn't find the solution among the living. Now we have the living and abiding Word of God. We don't need the dead. We have a living God who speaks to us right here in the scriptures through his Spirit. He looks for Samuel because Samuel was the closest thing to God that he had on earth. And when Samuel left, that was his connection to God. That was his relationship to God. Saul's relationship to the living God in heaven was based on a living man on earth. And when that man was gone, Saul's relationship was gone. And he had no connection to God after that. He couldn't fight his way to have a relationship with God. He needed a living man to connect him. Just like we need a living man to connect us. Who's that? Jesus. So Jesus connects us to God, and because he was dead and raised to life again, that bond will never break. We always have a connection to God. On a side note, so verse 12, the woman cried out and she was in shock. So she's like, fine, I'll call up this person, Samuel. I don't know who this Samuel is. Apparently she didn't really know. Because like, who's this guy asking? He's asking for Samuel. Do you know how many Samuels there are in Israel? There's a bunch. So she calls up this person and she is caught off guard. Something takes place that is not normal. She is experiencing an event that she was not prepared to experience. Whatever her past life of witchcraft produced, it didn't produce this. So she screams And then she turns around and she's like, I know exactly who you are. There's some divine connection, some insight that she's experiencing, that she sees Samuel and she recognizes Saul. We'll get into the theological stuff on the back end, like how does this all work? In the long and short, we don't know, so it's not a big deal. So now, verse 13, he says, what do you see? And she says, I see a God, or you guys say a spirit coming up out of the earth. The Hebrew word means heavenly, celestial. So where is God? In heaven. Where are spirits? It depends, generally speaking, in heaven. Where are angels? Generally speaking, in heaven. So there's this idea of celestial. She just says, I have this celestial being. Okay, who or what does it look like? It's an old man in a prophet's robe. The word for robe is a prophet's robe. It was like, it is a uniform. The prophets had a specific dress. We even find that with John the Baptist. John the Baptist wore camel's hair and he ate locusts. He filled the position of a prophet and he walked and looked and had the attire. So when she's explaining it to him, Saul is instantly like, that's the guy I need to talk to. That's Samuel. So he recognizes him. But what's interesting is he couldn't see him. So she could see him, but he couldn't see him. So he needed this third party to communicate back and forth. And that's what we're going to find in verses 15 through 19. 15 through 19. Then Samuel said to Saul, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? And Saul answered, I am in great distress, for the Philistines are warring against me, and God has turned away from me and answers me no more, either by prophets or by dreams. Therefore I have summoned you to tell me what I shall do. And Samuel said, why then do you ask me, since the Lord has turned from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done to you as he spoke by me. For the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David. Because you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek, therefore the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will give Israel also with you into the hands of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me. The Lord will give the army of Israel also into the hands of the Philistines. Samuel shows up. Now, what is his attitude like? So you see that the two men, they're both supposed to be the leaders of Israel, and they're both having a hard time. So Saul, last time he saw Samuel told him, you will never see my face again. I'm leaving and never returning. And that was the end of it. And now he's brought him up and he's like, why did you call me here? You're bothering me. You're ruining a good thing. So he says, why am I here? And what's Saul's response? He says, I have no hope. I have no ability to handle this situation. God has left me. He says, I have no hope. What do I do? And Samuel's response says, if God is now your enemy, if God is now against you, what sense does it make to turn to the dead? Why would you, at war with God, turn to me if the living God is not going to help you and is against you? And he uses this word very particular. Verse 16, Samuel said, why then do you ask me, since the Lord has turned from you and become your enemy? You are actively fighting against him, and he is actively opposed to you. So what difference would it make to talk to me? Verse 18, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not carry out his fierce wrath against the Amalekite, therefore the Lord has done this thing to you this day. You were disobedient. When we covered that text, we talked about how clear and concise God's commandment was. So he said 100%, and Saul said, well, I'll just do 99%. There was no leeway in the communication that God had with him. And so because he failed to be obedient. That's being thrown back in his face. But here's the thing. He says God had a fierce and angry wrath. Now, who was it against? The Amalekites, or Amalek, who was the king of those people. It says that God had a fierce and angry wrath against that person. You were supposed to go and be the instrument of God's wrath, but you refused to do that. And what was the consequences? God's wrath is now on Saul. God's fierce wrath was now on Saul. He has now become your enemy. Let's read Hebrews chapter 10. Verse 25 says that God's day of judgment is drawing near. And as we see that, we need to be busy doing God's will. And in verse 26, it says this, because if we go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins. And that's Saul. Saul knew the truth, and he willingly and deliberately turned from the truth and continued to sin. Therefore, in verse 27, but a fearful expectation of judgment and a fury of fire that will consume the adversaries. That is our expectation. There is no sacrifice to bring the forgiveness of sins, and therefore an expectation of fury of fire that will consume who? Adversaries. What's another word for adversaries? Enemies. Remember what Samuel said to Saul? He says, God is now your enemy, which means Saul is at war with God. And here we find out there's a judgment for God's enemies, his adversaries. Jump down to verse 31. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. A fearful thing. Now Saul has journeyed a very long time, 13, 15 years, been at war with God. But today is the day of reckoning. He calls up Samuel. Samuel shows up and tells him, you have an enemy. There's no point in talking to me. You are now going to fall into the hands of the living God. That's what we find in verse 19. So to fall into the hands of the living God is to fall into the Philistines' hand. And that's what we find in verse 19. Moreover, the Lord will give Israel also with you into the hand of the Philistines. And tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me. Where's Samuel? Oh, he did. Samuel's dead. And this is what he's saying. You and your children, your family, are going to come join me in Sheol, the place where the dead dwell. After all of this is said, what is Saul's response? What would you say to that? Let me rephrase that. The day of judgment comes. We've lived our lives. We think we've gotten away with being half-hearted or not really having a relationship with God or really walking in his commandments or taking him seriously. And the day arrives when we stand before him and he says, I hold you guilty. What do you say to that? Some people would try to justify it. Here's the best part about being judged by the ultimate authority in the universe. With every ounce of facts and details thrown in your face, there's zero justifications and there's zero way out. And so in verse 20, this is what we find. Then Saul fell at once full length on the ground, filled with fear because of the words of Samuel. That's his response. He just fell on the ground. He had nothing left. He was hopeless and he was without excuse. And here's the thing. This is a great picture of the day of judgment because this will be every single person without Christ. This is every person who refuses to acknowledge the Son and bless his name to the Father. They will stand before God and there will be no account, but the charge is brought to them and they will fall on their faces. That's it. There's zero excuses. There's no words to be said. It's absolute guilt. I've been there. I stood before a judge and they're like, what do you have to say for yourself? And I was like, I'm guilty. You got me, dead to rights. There's nothing I can do here. There's no point in trying to argue. This is just. This is righteous. This is what should be expected at the end when you've done all those things you knew you shouldn't have done. That was the realization that hit me. They're like, what do you have to say for yourself? Nothing. I'm guilty. I don't know what to tell you, Judge. I'm guilty. And that's exactly what he went through. So he falls down on the ground and he has no strength. So this is more of a question. It says he's got no strength because he wasn't eating both day and night. So the question would be, why has he not had food? Is it because he's been anxious? Is it because he's been fasting? Because there's things that we're told we can do to please God. There's, if you fast and pray, you can be healed of your disease, or you can make mountains move. Like if you fast and pray, that's what makes, in my mind, think that he was trying to get God's favor. But there's also another side of it. When I'm anxious, I am not hungry. Yeah. If Ruth is sick, or if my wife gets injured, or she's sitting on the side of the road, I'm not thinking about food. I'm anxious. I need to go take care of business. In fact, my stomach is in my feet because it hurts the anxiety that I have. So I think he's feeling the pressure. He's experiencing these things. He wants to get God back on his side, but he is absolutely abandoned. And he is cast out from the presence of the Lord. And he has no recourse. So this woman in verse 21, the woman came to Saul and she saw that he was petrified. He was terrified. And she said to him, behold, your servant has obeyed you, right? I listened to you and I've taken my life in my hand. Now you have to listen to what I have to say. Now, therefore, you also obey your servant. Let me set a morsel of bread before you and eat, that you may have strength when you go on your way. So I don't know why she's doing this. It could be out of honor. She knows he's the king, or it could be out of fear that she's trying to placate him, trying to, she doesn't want the wrath of the hanger. So she's like, well, get this guy some food because he's about to get real upset and he's going to take his wrath out on me. We don't really know. And maybe, you know what? She's a better person than Saul is. Maybe she sees a man in distress and is willing to do something good for him, right? Remember how we talked about last week? You have bad people who can do good things. This is one of those situations. She's an abomination to the Lord, practicing witchcraft, but she can also practice good hospitality, kindness, generosity. Right? On the outward appearance, everything seems great with this woman. She's done nothing wrong. I mean, she's only conjured the dead. Not a big deal, right? So verse 23, he refused. I will not eat. But his servants, together with the woman, urged him, and he listened to their words. So he arose from the earth and sat on the bed. Now the woman had a fatted calf in the house, and she quickly killed it, and she took flour and kneaded it and baked unleavened bread of it. And she put it before Saul and his servants, and they ate, and they rose and went away that night. He is not willing to receive food. There's something that can happen where you pretty much want to die, so you're not willing to sustain your life. You're not actively trying to kill yourself, but you're also not actively trying to survive. It's called passive suicide. He could be at the point where he's in so much despair, he just doesn't care to eat, or he's heard so much stuff that he's just not thinking about food. But one way or another, he's not having it. No food. But they eventually talk him into it. She makes $1,000 meal for him. She butchered a whole calf. She built a whole meal. She made a really nice meal for this guy, and she fed him and his friends. It doesn't say that any money exchanged hands. We have no idea what was the outcome for this woman, but they eat the food. She's very generous. She's very nice. She's a nice lady. And then they go back to the real world. It's like snap back to reality. I have to face the Philistines in the morning. Isn't this fun? And this is the promise that he got from the Lord. Hey, tomorrow when you fight the Philistines, you're going to die. Right? So he leaves, the men leaves, all of his children are going to die. That's the promise. Your sons, everybody, y'all are going to die. And how much of his army? Oh, that's right. All of Israel. All the Israel army, I'm going to give into the Philistines. You're going to lose this battle. You're going to suffer hard. And all of Israel is going to suffer because of you. That's the problem with being a leader. When you make mistakes, the people following you get kicked in the teeth with you. Let's talk about theology. What is theology? The study of God. Theology is the study of God. It's the study of things of God. Ultimately, it's the systematic understanding of what the Bible teaches. That's theology. So let's talk a little bit about theology. Are witches good? In our culture, are witches good or are witches bad? The general consensus in our culture is that practicing witchcraft, practicing the occult is not all that bad. In fact, if you go, we did this one time, Halloween, we went to one of those Halloween stores, you can find books that are like witch Bibles. They're, what do they call them? Spell books or something. Right. And here's the thing, it looks benign. It's like take chamomile and take a candle and make some chamomile of this thingy and then boil it over a candle and then bury it in your backyard and it'll bring you wealth. It seems benign. It seems like it's not a big deal. But here's the thing, just because it's sold to us that way, biblically, it doesn't mean that it's a good thing. Just because our culture says that it's good doesn't mean that it's a good thing. Just because this woman here isn't portrayed as being evil, wicked, terrible, that she like had horns on her head, it doesn't mean it's a good thing. So let's turn to Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 9. We'll read it from God's perspective. He says, when you come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not learn to follow the abominable practices of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone who burns his son or his daughter as an offering. Human sacrifice. That's the start. You shall not participate with offering your children as human sacrifices. Anyone who practices divination, tells fortunes, interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or a charmer, or a medium, or a necromancer, or one who inquires of the dead. For whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord. And because of these abominations, the Lord your God is driving them out before you. You shall be blameless before the Lord your God. That's the commandment. And this is God's perspective. Don't participate with human sacrifice. And along the same line, divination, talking to the dead, charmers, mediums, fortune telling. We call them palm readers and psychics and all of these different things. They are an abomination to the Lord. What is an abomination? Blasphemy. An abomination is something you hate with a passion. So let's say, this is heartbreaking, I'm going to say it anyways, God forbid, but if somebody murdered my wife, they would be an abomination to me. I would hate them. I couldn't stand the sight of them. So that is the same level that God has. He says, this is a thing I despise with a wrath and fiery fury. Remember what we read in Hebrews? Yeah, that's what I think of people who do these things. Not those people, but people who do these things. It's bad people doing bad things. God can't stand it. That's the theological perspective. The next one is, was Samuel actually the one speaking? Is this woman actually capable of bringing a spirit out of heaven or hell or wherever it is to have a conversation? Now, maybe to clarify, was it a demon? When we were studying it and talking about the story, was there anything in your mind that said, this is a demon because the Bible is telling me it's a demon? Old Testament theology is all the dead go down, right? We bury bodies in the earth, in the ground. So Sheol, they didn't make a distinction between heaven and hell. They just called it Sheol. When I go to Sheol, even if I go to Sheol. Theologically, in the Old Testament, there was no distinction between heaven and hell. It was just the place where the dead go. And they knew that there would be a place where God would have his people, but they actually assumed it would be on earth. That they assumed a resurrection from the dead. They didn't think it was going to be a spiritual place. If we take the text literally, it says that Samuel came. It says that Samuel said, and it depicts things that happened in the past in Samuel's life, as well as future events that God would have done. It's as if he's still acting as a prophet. So there's nothing in the text that leads us to believe that this was a demonic event, that it was the necromancer's powers that made this happen. It actually makes us think that God either allowed it or made it happen. And it's only happened one time in the entire Bible. It's not a normal event. It's not something that you would come to expect. It's a one-time occurrence for a one-time purpose. So therefore, theologically, when we look at it, you wouldn't say that this would happen again, and God either favors it or does not favor it. But there is Ezekiel 14:7. Now, for anyone of the house of Israel or of the strangers who sojourn in Israel, who separates himself from me, right? Listen to this. A person who separates himself from me, taking his idols into his heart, and putting a stumbling block of his iniquity before my face, says God, and yet comes to a prophet to consult me through him, I, the Lord, will answer him myself. So let's listen to this. A person who has separated themselves from me, a person who has set up idols in their own heart and is seeking one of my prophets to hear from me, I will answer him directly. That's what God says. I will speak to him. In verse 8, and I will set my face against that man, and I will make him a sign, a byword, and I will cut him off from the midst of my people, and you shall know that I am the Lord. This is what he says. If you are an enemy of mine, and you come to inquire of me, I will turn and face you face to face, and I will judge you and repay you your guilt. And I will pour out my wrath and fury on you. And that's what we just found with Saul. He was inquiring of God's man, even though he's at war with God, and God says, I answered him directly. And I spoke to him and told him what was going to happen, that he's an enemy of mine, and he and his sons and Israel will now suffer at the hands of the Philistines, because you will fall into the hands of the living God. So I think Samuel was actually there. I think that this was a weird, strange event that we can't explain. We don't know if God just allowed it or if God purposed it and drove it and said, I will make this thing happen to prove a point. So what he says here is that person who comes, I will use him as an example of what not to be. And that's what we find with Saul. He is definitely a good example of what not to do and what not to be. If I have a best friend who now we hate each other, did we lose our relationship or did our relationship change? We still have a relationship. It's just a really bad one. It's a negative one, right? We went from being bros and hugging to now throwing fists. So that connection still remains. So God did turn away from him, but did he turn away from him or did he turn his fury against him? Now there's consequences. So very good point. That's a very good connection. God using bad people for his purposes. That's providence. The explanation that you gave, Balak, the king of, Moab, wanted to curse Israel. So he went to Balaam, a prophet of the Lord, and he said, curse Israel for me and I'll give you money. And he's like, cool, whatever. And he's walking over there. And when Balaam sees Israel, the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him and he blesses Israel. He was there to curse them, but he blesses them. And he's like, I just have to speak what the Lord has given me to speak. And now Balaam's a false prophet. When you get into the New Testament, Balaam is not a good guy. His donkey spoke and showed him what's up. So, very good connection. Now, let's talk application. Let's talk about the power of fear. The power of fear. Saul was driven mad with fear. Fear took hold of him and destroyed him. It drove him to make choices and decisions that were not good for him, for Israel, or for anybody. His fear gripped him and controlled him. And then now let's talk about his choices. The power of his choices to disobey God, to kill all the priests, to chase after David, to continually war against God's purposes and God's plans, cornered him. He had no choice after a certain point. Here's the great thing about being young. You have so many choices. You can make a choice today that affects your future in 10 years. You have unlimited possibilities in your choices. You can change careers, you can make new friends, you can travel, go to different places. As you get older and as you make more and more choices, those choices become more and more limited and they start to corner you. You get pushed into a corner, and every choice that you've made up until that point has restricted choices that you can make after that. That's the difficulty of being young, is you don't know how to make good choices. And as you learn about good choices. And so you find out that these are good choices and those are bad choices. Saul is put in a box, and he is driven to the point where he turns to the people that he threatened to kill as a solution. He tore down the very thing that he built, and he put himself there by making really bad decisions along the way. Now, I don't want to forget this. There is a difference between Saul and David. And the reason why the scriptures have put us in this situation to be like, what is David doing? He's over there murdering all these people. He's in Philistine. What is he doing? He's like destroying whole villages. And now he's called into battle to go against the Israelites. David's choices bring consequences. But here's the thing about David. He's a genuine believer in the Lord God Almighty. He genuinely trusts and believes in Yahweh, and he hopes in him. He has a real relationship with God, and therefore, yes, he is an idiot at times, but his God does not forsake him. The Lord never turns his back on David, even though David makes so many bad decisions and so many sins. God is still with him. Saul is not that man. Saul has no real walk with the Lord, no real relationship with God. Saul is an evil person doing evil things. David is a good person doing evil things. We got power of fear, we got power of choices, getting cornered, and now this is the power of hopelessness. Saul has no hope and he loses all his energy. He is burnt. He is spent. He is exhausted. He's falling down on the floor, not eating, tired, exhausted, because he has no other options and he is hopeless. He has no destiny. He has no place other than being the king. He only hopes in this life, and therefore his life is about to end and he has no more hope. It is absolutely futile. Everything he does is meaningless. It's been meaningless for years, and he wasn't able to change it, and it's exhausted him. So the opposite of this, the opposite of fear is going to be faith. The opposite of choices and getting cornered is going to be getting clear direction from God. And then the opposite of hopelessness is hope. So first, the power of faith settles the heart, it settles the soul. We have no reason to fear. What can happen to you that will not benefit you in the end? There is nothing on this planet or in existence that can harm you beyond bettering you. Everything that happens to you happens for a reason. It is God's purpose, God's plan to get you where he wants you to be. And you know what says that? Faith. Faith believes that every struggle, every bump, every tragedy, every victory, every mountaintop experience, every success, every new job, everything we go through in our lives has a purpose, leading us to a destiny. So we do not need to fear. We have faith. We can see beyond our problems, and we can see our God working in our problems and using our problems to work in us. That's the faith that we have, and it settles us. We don't need to be afraid. We can be sure that God will hold us up. What can man do to us? Don't fear the one who can kill you. Fear the one who can destroy your soul in hell. Those are the words of Jesus. God will deliver you on the day of judgment. That's the faith you need. The power of directions, clear and concise movement forward. The difficulty that David and Saul are both going through is that they're not getting information from God, and they're making decisions in their lives that they think are going to solve their problems. David did it to get away from Saul. Saul is doing it to solve the Philistine battle. They have a problem, they're looking for a solution, but they don't have direction forward. And so they made choices that cornered them, and their choices got worse and worse and worse. What we need is clear, concise communication from God that tells us where to go, what to do, how to do it. And that's the power of the scriptures. That's the power of the Word of God in our lives. It is alive and active, and it gives us wisdom and knowledge and helps us to live a godly life here and the life to come. So we have clear direction from God, and then the power of hope. The power of hope. Saul had no hope. He had death and hell, and that's it. The power of hope cannot stop in this life. It has to proceed into eternity. If our hope is only in this world, Pastor read it last week out of Corinthians, if our hope is only in this world and Jesus is not resurrected and we will not be resurrected, we are the most pitiable people on the planet, because we lose everything for the sake of Jesus. We lose our lives, we lose our families, we lose our livelihoods. We lose everything for the sake of gaining Christ. So if we don't have hope in the resurrection, if we don't have hope in eternity, hope in heaven, we have nothing. But here's the good news. We do have all that hope. And in fact, that's the hope of Abraham and Sarah. It says that they hoped in a city that God would build. They hoped in a nation, in a country that would be God's country, that He would establish, and that it would be a place where they would live. It's like saying you live in Vegas, but you hope to live in Florida one day, and your dad is in Florida building you a wonderful, beautiful home. You hope that one day you're going to get there. You are excited about that future home that your Father is building for you. And our hope is not in this world. It's in the life to come. That's the solution that Saul didn't have. But that's the solution that David has. He has faith, he has directions, and he has hope. And we're going to find it sustaining him moving forward. Yeah, he's put himself in a bad situation, but it will get better. Only after it gets worse. Yeah. So next week, come back for 1 Samuel 29, David struggles, catastrophic meltdown. It's going to be really fun. David's going to get his comeuppance.